Hi, everybody. It's been 2 weeks since our last COVID report, so it's time for another update. And so I'm just going to start sharing my screen with all of you. It's all actually really good news, almost all good news. So just a brief overview, global cases continue to decrease. Eastern Europe is emerging as a possible new hotspot, but Brazil is stabilizing. Cases and hospitalizations and finally mortality are all decreasing in the US and California, and about 66% of California is now fully vaccinated. So let's just get right into the vaccination stats. Unfortunately, the United States continues to fall. There is now really no Western first world nation that is below us as far as vaccination rate. We are kind of lingering down at the mid 50s range, but that is a slight increase from what we were before, so that's encouraging. You can see that 186 million Americans are fully vaccinated, and now actually 6 million people have received a booster. And you can see that in the age over 12 or 18, we're still down in the 60s, but in the elderly population over 65, we're actually doing better, over 83%. And when you look at how many administered doses per day, we're now at 0.94 million per day, which is a little bit of an increase from what it was just a couple of weeks back. So that is also good news. Unfortunately, this slow rate of progression of vaccination has pushed even further out our projection for when we're going to have the majority of our population vaccinated, and that's now out to July of next year. And you can see that these states that we kind of look at every time I go through this are the ones that really don't significantly change week over week and continue to not have very high rates of vaccination. You can see that even in the states that have had high rates of vaccination, there is now no longer many significant increases over the last 2 weeks because the states that did a good job really don't have a whole lot of increment to go through. When you look at California, we took a dip and then are now back at about 0.87 million per 7-day average. So that's good. And when you look at how many are fully vaccinated, California compared to the US and our overall patient population or overall population is doing well. We're leading by about 5 percentage points. But when you look at that elderly population, as I mentioned before, we unfortunately are lagging, and we are now lagging a full 10 percentage points behind the overall US in our elderly patient population with vaccination rate. Thankfully, in Santa Clara County, we are doing well, both in the age over 16, age over 12, and even in the elderly age over 65 population. We are much more in line and in step with the United States overall versus California as a state. When we start looking at cases, you can see the number of cases continues to rise, but it is rising at a much slower rate than it has been recently. And again, the case fatality rate remains quite low ever since November, December of last year, when we really began to understand how to treat this disease process when patients do become very sick, and we've been able to keep that fatality rate low. The great news is that globally, we've seen a 20% drop over the last 2 weeks, and you can see this really nice slope that's coming down overall. You can see that Eastern Europe, these nations in Eastern Europe, are newly dark, they're newly hot spots. And other than that, the US and UK are slowly improving. And Brazil, if you recall, 2 weeks ago, had a little bit of an increase, but now that has stabilized and is decreasing again. So that's good news, because often what starts there can circle around to the Northern Hemisphere some months later. When you look at these trajectories of newly confirmed cases in these different nations that we've compared to ourselves time and time again in these presentations, you can see that it's great that Israel, Cuba, the UK, and even us at this point are now all coming down. No one is continuing that spike upwards. And I've added Brazil, so you can see this little spike up in their case reports, but now it's come down and stabilized again. So that's great news as well. When you look at national cases, you can see that we are also now decreasing nationally. And then when you look at where are the hotspots in the US, You can see this persistence at the kind of top of the map in the north, northwest, Alaska, Maine. And this could be simply residual from the initial Delta surge that has kind of fallen off those southeastern and southern states and now just kind of traveling upwards. Or you could say that it is starting to become fall and it is starting to be colder in these northern states. And we may be seeing a rise because of that, as we saw last year. So certainly something to keep an eye on. You can see this mirrored when you look state by state, where the blue squares are coming down off of their peak and the pink or red squares are rising. And you can see that all of these areas that I've pointed out, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Delaware, all of these are rising. And we'll have to keep an eye on and see if this is just a little fall off of the Delta surge, that is the end of it, or if this is the start of something new. When you look at cases in California, you can see that cases are also decreasing here. And in Santa Clara County, thankfully, cases also are decreasing. And in San Mateo County, cases are also decreasing. You can see this nice slope downwards in that lower line graph. When you look at Stanford cases, just remember that the blue lines are actually just number of tests that are being done, not the number of positive. In order to look at the number of positive, it's that small red number. You can see there was a little bit of an uptake in the last few weeks as students have come back and started class in the fall, but this last week was down again, so that's good news. And our overall positivity rate remains quite low, even compared to the surrounding county. The same holds true for Stanford faculty, postdocs, and staff. Again, an increase in overall surveillance testing, but the numbers remain nicely controlled. When you think about variants, Delta remains the story. It's still over 99% of all cases in the US. And when you look at proportions by state, you can see that not only in California, but overall, Delta is really the main variant. And, in California, you can see just these small, less than 1% of the population of positive tests are anything else. And if you recall, when we first started hearing about these Delta plus variants, people were concerned that this was going to be an even greater problem. But you can see by this graph that that's not the case, that Delta, the original Delta variant, has really outperformed any of the variants that have come off of it because it is really the dominant strain at this point. When you look at the WHO variants of concern, these have not changed over the last 2 weeks, but when you look at the designated variants of interest, these have narrowed. If you remember, there were other variants on this list before, Eta, Sigma, things like that, but now it's just Lambda and Mu. And if you recall, 2 weeks ago, I put this slide up for all of you to keep an eye out for this new variant that's R.1. And interestingly now, just in the last week, we have seen a news article showing 53 cases of this R.1 variant detected in California. There are no cases thus far in the Bay Area, so this has been outside of the Bay Area that these were detected. So something to keep an eye on. We don't really know what this means yet. Another area that I pointed out last report was the A.23.1 variant arising out of Africa. Along with this B.1525, these are variants that are different enough from the original ancestral strain that researchers and scientists and physicians have been concerned that perhaps this could escape our current vaccination or medications that we have. This is a recently published data collection from all the African countries, which we really haven't had before. It's been difficult to collect data and analyze that data in Africa overall because there is less infrastructure and less resources to do that type of study. So with some outside organizational help, this has been able to get together and be published. And you can see, although there is a little bit of sensationalism perhaps in the writing of this media article, the Sydney Morning Herald, you can see this last line, it would be prudent to assume the worst. Now, I don't know if I would go that far, but I do think that this is something that we should keep an eye on. These variants are an area that we should just have a heads up about and track carefully. Specifically in Santa Clara County, you can see that, again, Delta is the main story, and now the Delta plus variants are so few and far between that they're really included now under all those total Delta cases. You can see that the new variant cases, we now have 47 in the Santa Clara County, and there was actually a Newsweek article that came out last week claiming that mu variant had been eradicated from the US, and you can see that that is actually not the case, and that is a good example of not believing everything you read, because a term like eradication probably was not used in a scientific way in that article. So finally, Lambda variant, there still are here in Santa Clara County, and there was one new case in the last 2 weeks. When we look at the pediatric population, unfortunately, there has been an increased persistent rise in the accumulated number of child cases since the beginning of the pandemic, 7% increase over the last couple of weeks. And this has brought us to close to 27%. And remember, that's comparative to just 15% up until August throughout the entire pandemic. Now, certainly this does not translate necessarily to a huge number of hospitalizations or mortality. You can see that those numbers still remain well controlled, although they are higher than they were before. And this, I think, is an interesting graph to look at from the CDC. You can see that the overall trajectory of school-aged children and their cases per 100,000 broken down by age. And you can see that in all these age groups, that right around the beginning to mid-September, there's been a slight uptick. And certainly that must have correlated with school openings, and we'll just have to wait and see where the trajectory of this graph goes. Will it continue to rise, or will it be able to stable out and come down? When you look at hospitalizations in the US, you can see, thankfully, this number is also decreasing at this point. And when you look at hospitalizations in California, you can see these numbers are also decreasing, both total COVID-19 hospitalizations as well as ICU hospitalizations. The same is true for Santa Clara County, decreasing. We only had 27 patients in ICU with COVID-19 as of 2 days ago, and the same is true for San Mateo County. San Francisco itself does have a significant decrease off the peak of this surge, but you can see at the end of this graph, there has been a little recent jog where it has not continued that trajectory downwards in the same rate. So a little stabilization. We'll have to wait and see if that continues downward or it does something different. Overall, over the entire Bay Area, thankfully the trajectory is continuing to decrease, and we've had close to a decrease of 250 cases over the last 2 weeks. So mortality overall, finally, is also decreasing. There's always a little lag in this catching up with the decrease in cases and hospitalizations, but now mortality is also decreasing across the US, and it is also decreasing in California, and thankfully it is also decreasing in Santa Clara County. And I just wanted to put this last slide up to just show that there's been a lot of discussion about the rate of vaccination within a population and the mortality rate. And we know from a lot of data and studies showing that the more vaccinated a patient population is, the least mortality there is in that population. However, there's been a lot of concern and discussion about the fact that people are still able to contract the virus, what is called so-called breakthrough infections. And I want to just direct your attention to this first graph here, where it is true that you certainly can still get COVID-19 if you are vaccinated. But if you look at this population, this is looking at the California population, unvaccinated people were 8.1 times more likely to contract COVID-19 than fully vaccinated people. So even just your chance of getting it is much less. Certainly when you look to the second graph, unvaccinated people were unfortunately 17.5 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than fully vaccinated people. So that is really where the huge difference lies, but there is a significant difference even in the amount of cases contracted when you have vaccination. So on that note, I will stop sharing, and I hope once again that this has been helpful for you in making decisions about what you and your family and friends are going to do in the following couple weeks and month. I will see you soon. Bye.